The tension in the room was palpable as Lena finally confronted her family about the years of sacrifice and betrayal. Just when she thought she was free, the door swung open. And in walked a familiar face, one she never expected to see again. This unexpected visitor held the key to everything Lena had been fighting for. But their presence changed everything in ways she couldn't have imagined. The family's dirty secrets were about to be exposed, and Lena's world was about to shift forever. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we'll dive into a deeply emotional story about a woman named Lena, who had to face a family full of high expectations and relentless demands. For many years, she lived for others, sacrificing her own happiness to keep her family intact, only to realize that she had been forgotten and taken advantage of. Have you ever felt like you were caught up in the expectations of others, losing sight of who you really are? This story will show you how Lena faced these challenges and overcame them to reclaim her freedom and happiness. Watch until the end to see how Lena rediscovered herself and took back her power. And if you enjoy this story, please help me reach 1,000 subscribers soon so I can continue bringing you more interesting and inspiring stories. Thank you so much. Lena sat in her office, the hum of her computer screen casting a soft glow on her face as she stared at the emails piling up. A senior architect at a top-tier firm in New York City, she had built her life on independence. The city lights below her loft apartment twinkled, offering the same sense of calm and chaos she had learned to embrace. But today, something felt different. The ringing of her phone cut through the quiet. It was her mother. "Lena, we need you to come to dinner tomorrow. It's time we all talk." Her mother's voice quivered slightly. "Your father wants to fix things." Lena froze. Her parents hadn't reached out in years, only contacting her when their own financial troubles loomed large. There was a flicker of hope in her chest, but it was quickly stifled by the years of neglect. Why now? Why did they want to fix things after all this time? With a sigh, she accepted the invitation. She didn't know why, but maybe, just maybe, this dinner could change things. Maybe she could finally understand why, despite all the sacrifices, they never seemed to care about her. The drive to her parents' house in the suburbs of New Jersey felt endless. The heavy weight of her decision, the decision to come back after so many years of distance, settled deeper into her chest with every mile. The streets were familiar, yet they no longer felt like home. She had forgotten how quiet the suburbs could be, the kind of quiet that pressed down on you when everything around you felt still, frozen in time. As Lena turned onto the street, the old neighborhood greeted her with an odd sense of familiarity and discomfort, like an old, half-remembered dream. When she finally parked her car in the cracked driveway of the house where she had grown up, Lena couldn't help but notice how different it looked. The house, once full of life and laughter, was now overrun with weeds. There was no trace of the neat rows of tulips and daffodils that her mother had spent hours tending to. The garden had become a forgotten place, much like the family itself. The heavy air of disrepair lingered as if the house was sighing under the weight of time and neglect. Lena stood for a moment, staring at the house, her hand resting on the door of her car. She could feel the memories rushing back, but they were distant, like faded photographs in an album she hadn't looked at in years. This place used to be her sanctuary, a refuge from the world, but now it felt like a crumbling relic of better days. Taking a deep breath, she made her way up to the front door. As she reached for the handle, she hesitated, the familiar chime of the doorbell now seeming out of place. Felt like she was stepping into a scene from her past. A past she had tried to leave behind, but it was all too much for her to process. The door swung open before she could ring the bell. Her mother, Alice, stood there with a forced smile plastered across her face. The smile was tight, the kind of smile you put on when you're trying to pretend that everything is fine when nothing really is. "Lena," Alice said, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to make it sound welcoming. "So glad you could make it. We've missed you." Lena's heart sank as she took in her mother's appearance. Alice looked tired, the kind of tiredness that ran deeper than physical exhaustion, a weariness of the soul. Her once vibrant eyes were dull, and her skin, once glowing, was now pale, as if the years had drained the life out of her. Lena forced a smile, but it felt like a mask, something she had learned to wear in order to protect herself from the truth. "We've missed you too," Lena replied, her voice flat. She stepped inside, looking around. The entryway was the same, but somehow different. The old coat rack that used to hold her father's worn-out jacket was still there, but now it looked out of place like a prop in a play. The hallway smelled faintly of the meatloaf and potatoes her mother was making, the familiar scent from her childhood, and for a moment, it almost felt like old times. Almost. Lena's father, Richard, stood at the stove, his back to her. He was flipping something in the pan with a practiced ease, the sizzle of food filling the silence. He didn't turn around when she entered. There was a time when he would have greeted her with a hug or a joke, but now he was simply a figure in the background of the house, a shadow of the man he once was. The way he stood there, so focused on his cooking, was unsettling. It was like he was too busy to acknowledge her, too busy to care. Max, Lena's younger brother, was sprawled out on the couch in the living room, his feet on the coffee table, his phone in his hands. Sarah, her older sister, was sitting beside him, doing the same thing. Both of them were engrossed in their screens, as if nothing had changed. It was as if they hadn't moved an inch since the last time Lena had seen them. They were stuck in their own little worlds, completely disconnected from the reality of what was happening. Lena's throat tightened and she fought to keep her emotions in check. She had come here with hopes of reconciling, of mending the broken parts of her family. But this was not what she had envisioned. The silence in the room was suffocating, and the coldness in the air made her skin crawl. It was like walking into a house full of ghosts. She made her way into the kitchen, trying to keep her composure, but her eyes kept darting between her family members, trying to find any trace of the warmth that used to exist here. Her mother, Alice, was bustling around the kitchen, setting the table with an artificial sense of purpose. There was no sense of joy in her movements, just the mechanical routine of a woman who had long ago given up on anything resembling happiness. "Do you need any help?" Lena asked, her voice tentative. Unsure. Alice looked up, startled as if Lena had just spoken a foreign language. "Oh no, sweetheart. Just sit down. Dinner's almost ready." Max didn't even bother to look up from his phone as Lena approached the table. "Hey, Lena," he said, not making eye contact. "Glad you're here." Sarah, on the other hand, barely acknowledged her. She flipped through a few more Instagram posts before muttering a half-hearted, "Hey," still glued to her phone. The lack of connection stung more than Lena had expected. They weren't even trying. It was as if they were just going through the motions of a family dinner, a family that no longer existed. Lena tried to shake off the feeling of being invisible, but it lingered like a heavy fog. Her stomach twisted as she sat down at the table. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that had been building for years and had finally come to a head. This wasn't a family gathering, it was a performance, a show put on to pretend that everything was fine when, in reality, nothing was. The meatloaf was placed in the center of the table along with mashed potatoes and green beans. The same meal that Lena had eaten so many times as a child, yet tonight felt like a stranger's dinner. She picked up her fork, but it felt heavy in her hand. The food was bland, tasteless, and the room was filled with the sound of silverware scraping against plates. But it wasn't just the silence that gnawed at Lena, it was the feeling that no matter how much she had given to this family, it would never be enough. And then, just as Lena was beginning to convince herself that this was all a dream, Alice spoke again, her voice tinged with an awkwardness that made Lena's stomach drop. "We've missed you, Lena." "Really?" Alice said, this time with more force, trying to sound convincing, but it felt forced. The words hung in the air, hollow and untrue. Lena forced another smile, but her heart wasn't in it. She looked around the table at her family, each one lost in their own world, disconnected from the reality of what was happening. And for the first time in a long time, Lena realized the truth. They hadn't missed her. They hadn't cared about her in years. This wasn't a reunion. This was a reminder of how far apart they had grown. And no matter how much she tried to hold on to the memories of the past, she couldn't ignore the fact that this was not the family she had once known. It was a family of strangers, bound together only by blood but not by love. The dinner started off as any other family gathering. The clinking of silverware against plates, the soft murmur of voices as mashed potatoes were passed around, and the occasional awkward joke about the weather. All of it felt painfully normal. So painfully normal that it almost fooled Lena into thinking that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to the family they once were. But that illusion didn't last long. Lena felt a tightness in her chest, the kind that came from trying to force a smile and pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Her eyes flickered from one family member to the next. Her mother, Alice, was seated at the head of the table, as she always had been, but there was no warmth in her gaze. No kindness in the way she set the silverware down. No sense of affection when she looked at her. The table, once a place of connection, felt like a battlefield now, a field where unspoken resentments and disappointments festered just beneath the surface. Max, her younger brother, lounged back in his chair, taking an obnoxious bite of his meatloaf as if he were a guest at a fast food joint, not in their family home. He was scrolling through his phone as if nothing in the world mattered, oblivious to the tension building in the room. Sarah, her older sister, was the same, her fingers flying over the screen of her phone, her eyes flicking between whatever shallow distraction was feeding her self-absorption. It was only when the silence between them thickened, when Lena could feel her heart pounding in her chest, that the bombshell was finally dropped. "So, about the will? Mom and Dad finalized it today," Max said, his voice casual, almost indifferent. He didn't even look up from his phone, as if he were discussing what he had for lunch or the latest sports scores. Lena's hand froze mid-air, the fork in her grip stilling as her stomach dropped. Her mind raced, heart skipping a beat. "The will?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, hoping she'd misheard him. It wasn't possible. She had to have misunderstood. But the look in her brother's eyes told her everything she needed to know. Her mother, Alice, didn't even bother to look up from her plate, continuing to cut her food with a mechanical precision. "Yes, dear? Your father and I have decided how to divide everything," Alice said, her tone flat, almost rehearsed. It was the same tone she used when making a grocery list or scheduling an appointment, detached, practical, and cold. "Max and Sarah will inherit the house, the car, and the savings. You don't need it. You've got your career, after all." The room seemed to freeze. The words hit Lena like a ton of bricks. The weight of them crashed down on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. Her body went rigid as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She stared at her father, who had been silent through all of this. He was now slicing his meat with an almost clinical precision. His eyes focused on the plate in front of him as though Lena's very presence didn't matter at all. The man who had never once thanked her for the years of financial support. The countless checks she had written to keep them afloat, the endless hours she had spent worrying about their well-being. And now this final slap in the face. "What about me?" Lena asked, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to hold it together to keep her tone steady, but the words caught in her throat. She knew she was fighting back tears. Fighting back a rage so intense she could barely control it. She had done so much for them, given up her own dreams, sacrificed so many things, and this was the response she got? Her mother sighed deeply, her gaze still fixed on her plate as if Lena's question wasn't worth acknowledging. "Lena, you don't need anything. You've made it on your own, and that's more than enough," she said dismissively. "Max is still trying to get his business off the ground. And Sarah, well, Sarah still has dreams, you know? Dreams." The word stung. Lena's thoughts flashed back to all the times she had paid for Sarah's fashion school, the tuition, the supplies. The countless hours of phone calls where Sarah asked for money to keep her dream alive. And Max, who had failed in every business venture he'd tried, was still being bailed out. His latest failed attempt at starting a craft beer company already draining Lena's savings. The sacrifices Lena had made were endless. She had sacrificed vacations, personal time, and financial security, pouring everything into helping them, and this was how they repaid her. A cold, calculated decision that stripped her of any claim to what should have been hers. Lena's eyes darted between Max, who was still casually chewing his food and scrolling through his phone, and Sarah, who was now absent-mindedly flipping through Instagram without a care in the world. They didn't even seem to notice the gravity of what had just been said. They were too caught up in their own self-absorbed worlds to see the betrayal that was unfolding. The anger inside Lena boiled over. She could feel her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. The hurt, the frustration, the years of being taken for granted, it was all crashing down on her in that one moment. How could they be so heartless? How could they do this after everything she had done for them? She looked at her father again, hoping for some sign of remorse, some flicker of the man she had once respected. But there was nothing. Richard's face was a mask of indifference. his eyes still glued to his plate as though this conversation, her pain, didn't matter at all. Lena's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, but she wasn't going to let them see how much it hurt. She refused to show weakness to let them win. "You know, I've spent over $200,000 on you guys," Lena said, her voice low but steady. Her eyes locked onto her father's unmoving figure. "I've paid off Sarah's school, helped Max with his failed businesses, covered your bills, your rent, and I've done it all without asking for a single thing in return. And now, you're telling me I don't need anything?" Her mother's eyes flickered briefly to her, but there was no apology there, no sign of guilt. Instead, Alice gave her the same cold, impersonal look, as if Lena's words were an inconvenience. "You don't need anything," she repeated. "You're doing fine on your own." Lena's blood boiled as the realization hit her like a freight train. They had never cared. They didn't see her as family. They saw her as a source of money, a means to an end. They had used her for years, draining her dry, and now, in the final act of betrayal, they were cutting her out completely. Her vision blurred with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. She was done. This was the last straw. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, breaking the silence. Her mother's eyes followed her, but Lena didn't look back. There was nothing left to say. "You've all made your choices," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet fury. "And now I'm making mine." She grabbed her coat from the back of the chair and walked toward the door, leaving the meal, the family, behind her. She didn't need them anymore. The weight that had been crushing her chest for so long started to lift as she stepped outside into the cold night air. For the first time in years, she felt something close to freedom. Lena's chest tightened as the full extent of what was happening slowly sank in. The realization washed over her in waves. They weren't interested in reconciliation. This dinner wasn't about healing or mending broken bonds. It wasn't even an attempt to make amends for the past. No, this was a calculated act, an orchestrated moment meant to drive her out once and for all, just like the will. They were cutting her out of their lives permanently. Her heart, which had once longed for the warmth of family gatherings, now felt colder than it ever had before. It was as if the very room had turned into a freezer, with each word spoken by her family crystallizing the distance between them. What was left of their ties, their connections, now seemed like thin threads easily snapped with a single pull. Lena could feel the heat rising in her neck, the familiar flush of frustration burning her skin. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was betrayal, pure and simple. "You really think I don't deserve a single penny?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and hurt. "After everything I've done for you? The tuition payments, the mortgage, the car repairs, the business loans, and this is how you repay me." The words came out in a rush, as though saying them aloud might help her understand the reality that felt so foreign. Max's response was as cold as the atmosphere in the room. He didn't even bother to look up from his phone as he took another bite of his meatloaf, glancing up only to smirk, his eyes full of that familiar arrogance. "You're the big-shot architect. You don't need anything from us," he said, dismissing her, his tone casual, as if what she was saying didn't matter at all. Lena's hand tightened around her fork, her grip white-knuckled. It was as though he had just poured salt in a wound that had been festering for years. She had spent years supporting him, paying off his debts, bailing him out of his business failures, and always being there when he needed money to keep his dreams alive. And now, he was treating her like an outsider, like she was somehow less than them, less deserving. Her stomach churned, the anger turning into something sharper, something colder. The memories flashed in her mind, the endless sacrifices she had made for this family, the countless hours of work she had put in to make her career a success so she could carry the weight of everyone else's problems. And now they were standing here, telling her that none of that mattered, that she didn't deserve a single dime of what they had. Her gaze shifted to Sarah, her older sister, who still hadn't said a word. Sarah was busy scrolling through her phone, likely lost in her own world, oblivious to the storm raging around her. The sight of Sarah's nonchalance made Lena's blood boil even more. She had paid for Sarah's fashion school. She had covered the rent when Sarah's freelance career fell apart. Lena had always put her family first, always been the one to hold everything together. And yet none of them seemed to understand, let alone appreciate, the weight of that. Lena's pulse raced and the room seemed to shrink around her. She could feel the heat building up in her chest, her breath coming faster. It wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't about the checks she had written or the bills she had paid. It was about the complete lack of respect. The utter disregard for the years of support, the emotional labor she had poured into them all. It was about the fact that, at the end of the day, they didn't see her as family. They saw her as a tool, a means to an end. Her father, Richard, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. His voice was low, and when he did look up, his eyes were cold, distant. He said nothing of apology or regret. "Lena, you've made it on your own. That's more than enough. You don't need any of this." The words cut deeper than Lena had expected. "I don't need any of this?" She repeated, her voice thick with disbelief. "This?" She gestured toward the room, toward the family that had failed her at every turn. Her eyes locked onto Richard's face, trying to read him, to see if there was even the faintest hint of remorse. But there was nothing. His expression was impassive, detached, as if he had already made peace with this decision, and with the fact that Lena no longer mattered to him. Lena felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The reality was sinking in, and the crushing weight of it was almost too much to bear. "I don't need any of this," she whispered to herself, the words carrying a finality she wasn't quite ready for. But it was true. She had worked tirelessly to build a life for herself, and in doing so, she had learned that her family, the very people she had sacrificed for, were no longer part of the equation. They had become strangers. A quiet rage bubbled up inside her, one that was too powerful to ignore. Lena stood up so suddenly that the chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound of the scraping chair reverberated through the room, breaking the silence, but no one moved, no one tried to stop her. She grabbed her coat from the back of the chair, her fingers trembling as she slipped it on. She didn't care if they watched her leave, didn't care about the looks of judgment or disdain. "I'm done," she said, her voice laced with fury. But there was something else there too, a deep, seething sadness. "I'm done with all of you," her father called out after her, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded suspiciously like anger. But she didn't look back. "You'll regret this," Richard said, his tone carrying a weight of finality, as though he believed he could guilt her into staying, into turning back. But Lena had already made up her mind. She didn't look back. Not once. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, and as she stepped out into the cool night air, a strange feeling of freedom washed over her. It was as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, a weight she didn't even realize she had been carrying for years. She had finally walked away from the family that had never truly seen her. The family that had used her, manipulated her, and then discarded her when they no longer needed her. And as she stepped out into the night, she realized that the hardest part was not leaving them behind. The hardest part was accepting that they were never the family she had hoped for, and that maybe, just maybe, she was better off without them. The next few days felt like an unrelenting whirlwind. Lena's phone buzzed incessantly, each notification a jab at her already fragile composure. Messages poured in from her family, guilt trips from Alice, threats from Max, and passive-aggressive texts from Sarah. The familiar ding of each message felt like a small explosion in her chest. Each one a reminder of the family she had once desperately tried to hold together. But Lena stood firm, her resolve hardening with each new message. She had spent far too long putting everyone else first, sacrificing her own happiness for their comfort, their stability. She had been the one to give, to carry, to bear the weight of their expectations. No more. She would not let them drag her down again. The emotional toll of those years had already taken too much from her. The messages came in waves, like a rising tide of resentment, and Lena could almost feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. Alice's texts were the worst, dripping with the kind of guilt that only a mother could manufacture. "Lena, why are you doing this? Don't you care about your family? We're falling apart without you." Each word felt like a dagger to her heart, but she knew deep down that this wasn't about family. It wasn't about love. It was about control, about them wanting to maintain their grip on her. Even after she had done so much for them, she was the one who had always been the pillar, the bank, the emotional support, the glue that held everything together. But now, when she needed them, they were nowhere to be found. Max predictably responded with his usual fury. The messages from him were filled with bitterness, laced with threats. "You'll regret this, Lena. You're making a huge mistake. You've ruined everything." His words felt empty, just like his promises and his failures. She had supported his doomed business ventures, bailed him out when his attempts at starting a career fell flat. But now all he saw was his own inability to succeed and someone else to blame. He had never cared about her sacrifices, never once acknowledged how much she had given. And then there was Sarah. Her passive-aggressive messages were the hardest to stomach. Sarah's tone was sweet, almost sugary, but it carried a sharp edge. "You really think you can walk away from us, Lena? It's so selfish of you to act like none of this matters. You've always had everything handed to you, haven't you?" It was the same old story. Lena, the successful one, the one who had her life together, the one who could always be counted on to fix everyone else's problems. The irony was never lost on Lena. After all, it was Sarah who had dropped out of fashion school after Lena had paid her tuition, and it was Sarah who had freeloaded off Lena's generosity for years. Lena could feel her anger rising with each new message, but she pushed it aside. She wasn't going to let them manipulate her anymore. The more they attacked her, the more she realized just how deep the wound went, how much they had taken from her without ever once giving anything in return. But things didn't stop there. The family's campaign against her moved from private messages to a very public arena: social media. Lena woke up one morning to a notification from a friend, alerting her to a viral video that was circulating. Her stomach sank as she clicked on the link. The video was posted by Sarah, and it painted Lena as the villain, greedy, self-absorbed, a person who had turned her back on her own family for the sake of her career. The video quickly gained traction, its emotional manipulation resonating with viewers. Sarah had carefully curated the narrative, showing only the side of Lena that served her story. She included footage from family gatherings where Lena had expressed frustration, moments when Lena had spoken her mind about how much she had given to the family, but Sarah edited it all to fit the narrative of a cold, ungrateful daughter. Lena watched in disbelief as the video gathered thousands of views, followed by a flood of hate comments. Her stomach churned with nausea as the comments poured in. "What a heartless person. She doesn't deserve a family, all she cares about is herself." The words were harsh, cruel, and unforgiving. It was like a knife to the chest, but she didn't break. Not this time. At that moment, Lena knew that she could no longer hide in the shadows. They had tried to paint her as the villain, and for a moment she thought it might work. But something in her snapped. She was done being the punching bag. The years of silence, the years of giving, of sacrificing her own happiness, they had come to an end. Lena took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she set her phone down. She wasn't going to let them tear her down. She wasn't going to let them rewrite the narrative. This was her life, her story, and no one, not even her family, had the right to take that away from her. She opened her bank account app and began the process of cutting all ties. She canceled the recurring payments she had been automatically sending them for years. The mortgage payments, the rent, the car repairs, all of it. Gone. No more. She didn't owe them anything. Not anymore. As the confirmation notifications appeared on her screen, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She had been terrified at first, terrified of the backlash. Terrified of being alone, terrified of the family she had tried so hard to protect and save. But now she felt something new: freedom. She had broken the chains that had bound her for so long. And though the road ahead would be difficult, she was ready to walk it on her own. Lena sat back in her chair, staring at the empty screen of her phone. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She wasn't the villain they had tried to make her out to be. She was a woman who had done her best, who had loved unconditionally, and who had finally chosen to love herself. The next few weeks were a blur, a mix of confronting her own emotions, navigating the fallout from her family's attacks, and slowly rebuilding her life. But Lena knew one thing for sure: she would never go back to the person she was before, the person who had been willing to sacrifice everything for people who never truly saw her. She would never again be their safety net. She was done with that life. And as she moved forward, she finally began to see the world not as a place where she had to fix everyone else's problems, but as a place where she could live for herself. And that, she realized, was more than enough. Lena stood at the edge of the city, staring out at the sprawling skyline before her. The skyline that once felt like a symbol of her burdens now seemed like a horizon full of possibilities. The weight of her family's demands, their expectations, and their lies were finally gone. She had severed those invisible ties that had held her in place for so long, shackling her to their needs and their manipulations. For the first time in years, she felt free, truly free. The city before her was no longer a place where she had to play a role, no longer a place where she was expected to give more than she could afford, emotionally and physically. For the first time, Lena wasn't walking through her life on autopilot. She was awake. She was breathing. She was present. The wind tugged at her hair, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the cold air fill her lungs. She had spent so much time catering to her family's needs that she had forgotten the feeling of the breeze against her face, the sound of her own heartbeat. She had forgotten what it felt like to be truly herself, to be someone who didn't have to live up to someone else's idea of who she should be. Lena's hands, which had often been tied up in obligations, now rested comfortably at her sides. She felt something stir within her, a slow awakening, a realization that there was so much more to life than the limited world she had confined herself to. She started focusing on her own life again, the things she had abandoned, the pieces of herself that had slipped through the cracks over the years. There were things she had once dreamed of doing but had put off for the sake of family, trips she had postponed, thinking there would always be time later. Art she had abandoned because she told herself that being practical was more important than pursuing passion. Adventures she had missed because there was always someone else's crisis to manage, someone else's problem to solve. The guilt, which had once been a constant companion, was nowhere to be found now. It had been replaced by a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that it was okay to live for herself. Her life was hers to live, and not just any life, but one where she could finally follow her heart. She realized that all along it hadn't been about the money or the material things. It wasn't about paying off debts, buying gifts, or maintaining the facade of a perfect family. It was about rediscovering herself, about reconnecting with the parts of her that had been buried under the weight of others' expectations. It was about taking back the pieces of herself she had given away so freely and, often, without gratitude. Lena remembered the art classes she had taken as a child, the way she used to lose herself in the swirl of paint on canvas, the satisfaction of creating something from nothing. She hadn't picked up a brush in years, but now, she could feel the pull of that old passion. Her fingers itched to create. She wasn't sure where to start. But the idea of returning to that part of her life filled her with a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in so long. She signed up for a painting class the next week. It felt like a small step. But for Lena, it was monumental. The act of committing to something just for herself, something that didn't require her to be the fixer, the caretaker, or the provider, felt like a quiet revolution. It wasn't just about the art, though. It was about reclaiming her happiness, the kind of happiness that came from within, not from external validation. Lena had spent so much of her life measuring her worth by what she could give, how much she could carry, and how much she could provide for others. But that wasn't who she was. She wasn't a bank. And she wasn't a therapist. She was a person just like anyone else, deserving of joy, freedom, and self-expression. Her own story was finally hers to write. And she wasn't going to let anyone dictate it anymore. Not her family, not their guilt, and certainly not the expectations they had tried to impose on her for years. She had spent too long silencing her own voice, afraid to upset the delicate balance of familial obligation. Now, her voice was the only one that mattered. Lena began to make decisions based on her own desires, not out of fear of conflict or disappointment. She booked a trip to Iceland, something she had always dreamed of. She could see herself hiking across the volcanic landscape, feeling the spray of waterfalls on her face, and letting the isolation of the place soothe the scars that had been left on her soul. She didn't need anyone's approval to go on this trip. It was hers, and it was the first step toward rebuilding her life on her own terms. As the weeks went by, Lena found herself making space for things that filled her heart. She took long walks in the park, letting the silence of nature help her process the whirlwind of emotions she had been through. She started journaling again, pouring her thoughts into the pages without worrying about how they would sound to anyone else. Her art, her travel, her personal growth, they were all pieces of a larger picture she was finally allowed to complete. Lena had found her power again. It wasn't something that was handed to her or something she needed to fight for anymore. It was hers, something she had always had, just buried under layers of guilt, duty, and family drama. She was learning how to trust herself again, how to believe that she deserved to live for her own happiness. She also began to reconnect with old friends, people who remembered her before the weight of her family's demands had consumed her. These relationships weren't born out of obligation, but out of shared joy, mutual respect, and genuine affection. She had spent so long living to meet the needs of her family that she had forgotten what it felt like to have friendships built on mutual love and respect. Now, she was building those relationships once more. Her world had expanded in ways she never thought possible. She no longer felt confined by the walls of her childhood home, by the limits that her family had imposed on her. She felt open, expansive, like she could be anything she wanted. And the beautiful part? She didn't have to prove it to anyone. As she stood on the balcony of her new apartment, looking out at the skyline once again, Lena felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. Her life was her own, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to apologize for it. She was finally living the life she had always deserved, one that was filled with authenticity, joy, and freedom. Lena wasn't just reclaiming her financial independence. She was reclaiming her happiness. And in doing so, she had found herself again, not the person her family had shaped her to be, but the woman she was meant to be all along. As the months passed, Lena's life slowly but surely transformed. Her career flourished even more, she reconnected with old friends, and she even started dating again. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Her loft, once a lonely sanctuary, was now filled with joy, laughter, and creativity. She had fought for her peace, and now it was hers to keep. What do you think about Lena's journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts, feelings, or any feedback you have. Feel free to leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Thank you so much for listening to the entire story. Your support truly means the world to me.